Hello, my name is Mike Burns. I'm a local psychotherapist and trainer with Lifeline Northern Beaches, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Welcome to this evening's Technology, Gaming and Online Safety Parent webinar. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Whether you are a parent, carer, teacher, coach, mentor or interested party in this subject matter, we thank you for tuning in and for acknowledging the importance of young people's well-being, particularly during this challenging time. This webinar will cover some important issues you may be facing in our current COVID world, as young people are required to utilise technology and the internet in education, recreation and their personal lives. You will learn strategies tonight to support your child's healthy relationship with technology as they navigate these increasing demands of online participation. In this webinar, we'll hear from leading child and adolescent psychologist Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg, Aware Founder Andrew Kinch, and ySafe Executive Director Yasmin London. Each presenter will speak for approximately 15 minutes, leaving us 15 minutes of question time at the end. So firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't watched a webinar using Zoom before, please note that your camera and microphone are automatically disabled. The webinar will be recorded and available on the Northern Beaches Council website over the next week or so, and a link will be emailed to registered participants along with some of the resources discussed this evening. Questions can be asked anonymously throughout the webinar via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try and get to as many of these as possible during the Q&A period at the end. So feel free to submit those questions at any stage. So our first speaker tonight is one of Australia's highest profile psychologists, author, broadcaster and specialist in parenting, children, adolescence and mental health. He wrote his PhD at the University of New South Wales on adolescents with cancer and named and founded Canteen over 30 years ago with a group of young cancer patients. He has worked as an academic, researcher and political lobbyist and is the author of 17 books. Please welcome Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to be here. My association with the Northern Beaches Council goes back so many years now. I'm broadcasting from Melbourne, the COVID capital of Australia, and I was hoping I'd be able to get up there this year, but doesn't look like it, but never mind. So I just wanted to kick off with a sort of brief overview of the state of well-being for young people at the moment. And obviously when we talk about young people, it's a generalization. A lot of the problems that I'm going to talk about are far worse in our Indigenous community, young people living as homeless, young people with disability, incarcerated, LGBTIQ+, and therefore please accept the fact that I'm generalizing. So BC, as we refer to it, before coronavirus, 1 in 7 children and 1 in 4 young people had a mental health challenge. There is no question, if you just look at the literature from Mission Australia and the Black Dog Institute, that a lot of these problems are what they refer to as PSMI, or probable serious mental illness. So we're not talking about just feeling a bit sad or a bit anxious from time to time. And I think one of the great challenges for people working with young people in health education or welfare at the moment is to in fact identify these young people early. Early identification, prompt diagnosis and treatment is associated with a much better outcome. But sadly, that's not happening. I gave you the figures, 1 in 7 children, 1 in 4 teenagers, but less than 35% of those individuals actually get treatment. And this is hugely problematic. We know that there is a significant difference between a little bit of anxiety and an anxiety disorder, between sadness and mood disorder, but I'm not sure that we've really cracked the emotional literacy stuff. I'm sure the other speakers today will talk about digital literacy, and obviously that's important, but I think that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface when it comes to emotional literacy. Now, whether or not a young person is going to develop a psychological problem depends on a group of really complex factors. There's 5 domains in which we as psychologists look at: the individual, their friends, their family, their school, and of course their context in the community. And many, many young people that I see have significant risk factors in all 5 domains and very few protective factors. This is hugely troubling and worrying, because people often say to me, well, when are we going to solve the problem of bullying, or when are we going to solve the problem of depression or anxiety? It's so complicated, because in order to address a lot of those issues, you've got to sort of stamp out physical, sexual and emotional abuse in families. You've got to stamp out poverty. Probably not going to happen in a kind of flash. I also think that we need to talk about the building blocks of well-being. And if you are at all interested in the well-being of young people, then we've got to talk about diet, sleep, exercise, because those issues are huge. And I recognize that while I'm a huge fan of technology, I promote the use of e-therapy constantly. I'm a huge fan of, well-constructed, co-designed and clever smartphone apps. But the reality is that sometimes if you've got a young person who's staying up for 15 hours a day, and then the technology is interfering with something as basic as sleep. We now know that there is a connection between mood and food. We didn't know that 15 years ago, but now we know that the more high fat, high sugar, high processed foods you eat, the more likely you are to have a serious psychological problem. And of course, can't avoid talking about social media. And I think that there is a bit of a phenomenon out there at the moment. I'm sure the other speakers will talk about it, the compare and despair phenomenon, which is alive and well. And there are a lot of young people that I see who are struggling with serious insecurity because they compare their behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel on social media. And I think social media has become, for some, not all young people, social comparison on steroids. And indeed, the psychological world of a lot of our young people is dramatically different now to the one even that they once knew, particularly with COVID. And before coronavirus, we had difficulties. Now they're really significant early signs that the demand for mental health support for young people is increasing. We've seen a 28% year-on-year increase in calls over the last 3 months just to Kids Helpline. And this, I think, is indicative of a really simple and very easy to understand phenomenon. There are 4 things that young people really need to do growing up. One is to emancipate from the adults around them. The second is to acquire the skills for future economic independence, i.e. go to school. The third is essentially to figure out who they are. And the fourth is to hang out with their friends. Now, if you think about it, all 4 of those key developmental tasks have been significantly affected by the coronavirus. And that's thwarted a lot of those developmental tasks, and it's forced young people to rely for a long period of time on social media. Now, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. I was already worried before I saw that show about whether reality could be lost on social media. I worried that young people that I see might be sacrificing their mental health and well-being by spending too much time on this. And what that show convinced me, and I'm sure the other people will talk about this as well, that those all-seeing social media apps are essentially digital snake charmers, and they hypnotize our young people. They seriously can affect the way they see themselves and the world. And in many respects, the adults in their lives have been lulled into tolerating this. And I'm just a little bit concerned about what that has actually done. Have our young people, in fact, become the guinea pig generation? And this show essentially demonstrated the people who built the technology and created the world's richest companies are now admitting how their own platforms are designed to kind of penetrate and mine the minds and lives of the consumers. So I'm not as blasé as perhaps I used to be about Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. And that's just the reality. I wonder whether or not it was wise for us to sit back and watch this first lot of children go onto Instagram, having essentially lied about their age and started as early as grade 3 and end up essentially hijacked by and handcuffed to their screens. So we've got this inevitable comparison, particularly of appearances, and for all the good that social media does in connecting young people with each other and their community, the plain truth is now that if a young person is feeling worse and goes on social media, they usually come off feeling even much worse. So that's my sort of opening line.
That's great, Michael. Thank you. You've really encapsulated some of the key concerns around online use, and the social dilemma really highlighted, didn't it, the idea that we can, you know, the commodity of someone's attention, you know, that the goal of making money from those platforms is to try to get people to pay as much attention as possible and find ways of getting them to spend more and more time online. So it's a deliberate design to do that, which is certainly concerning given all of the impacts, as you've described so well, of online usage and an overuse of those technologies, which can impact sleep and diet and exercise and all those other things, which have significant flow-on effects to mental health as well. So really important. And you talk about a growing awareness in yourself about these issues. And I think the reason we're having this webinar tonight is there's a growing awareness in our community of some of the implications of this technology use. So it's a really important discussion that we're having tonight. So Michael, at what age do you think that young people should have access to the internet?
Well, it's a very common question. I get it all the time. And of course, age doesn't define maturity. So it's actually not about age. I think the great challenge, and I'm sure all my fellow speakers, certainly Yasmin will agree, that what we have to do is make sure that all young people have the skills, the knowledge and the strategies to use whatever aspect of the internet they choose to use in a safe, smart and responsible way. And quite clearly, we have kind of let the cat out of the bag. I've heard many cyber safety experts say, you know, no one should be on social media until they're 13. Well, I don't know what planet they're on. I go into primary schools and almost 70 to 80% of the grade 5s and 6 already have social media and have had it for ages. So I think the question is, at what age are they adequately prepared? And I think the community, parents, schools, certainly local councils have a really important role to play in equipping them with those skills.
Yeah, and certainly my read from the social dilemma was there's an intention as well to educate young people about the realities, the commercial realities and the real world, machinations behind the scenes of what actually goes on, so they can make their own decisions as well around how to use that technology, which I think is important. One thing I want to pick up on, Michael, that you mentioned was emotional literacy, and I want to ask you, how large is the effect, do you think, that technology has had on children developing that emotional literacy?
Well, I think, it's so interesting. I go into schools and I challenge anyone to do this, even if you've got a young person at home, and just to ask them a simple question, and that is, what's the difference between feeling sad and being depressed? And I would argue that 90% of the young people that I talk to don't in fact know the difference, which is interesting because one thing the internet has enabled us to do is a lot of mental health awareness. And we've got Are You OK Day, we've got Beyond Blue, we've got a myriad number of programs. And what it's shown me over the last 10 years, 20 years, is that raising awareness doesn't actually mean that you're translating that into knowledge. And the same goes for a lot of the cyber safety education. I'd be fascinated to hear what Yaz has to say about this, but I think that cyber safety education is incredibly patchy across Australia. There's some schools where there's virtually none, and there's some that do it really, really well. But in terms of emotional literacy, I think that the prime responsibility for that actually sits with parents. I think we need to talk to them about the connection, to talk with young people about the connection between their thoughts, their feelings and their behaviour. And I think we've got a long way to go in increasing emotional literacy, which is, by the way, things like anger management, problem solving, decision making, really fundamental skills for future life.
Thank you, Michael. I feel like we could talk on this all evening with you. You've got such a great way of delivering this information. We might see you again in the Q&A section. Thank you very much. So just a reminder to people, if you have any questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of these as possible at the end of the evening. So our next speaker is Andrew Kinch, who's the founder of Aware. So Andrew's aim is to help parents, schools, professionals and most importantly gamers themselves understand what it takes to hit the gaming sweet spot, where we don't play beyond the benefits, which can be problematic, but also how to get the most out of the experience to suit the many motivations that bring people to play video games. Aware hopes to educate young gamers to better understand themselves in order to become self-regulating and empower parents to better support their kids. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mike. How are you? Hey, everybody at home. I guess my hope tonight is to help give you a bit of insight, because this is a really largely misunderstood hobby. And I'm going to say it's largely misunderstood by parents, and that's probably a fair statement. It's actually largely misunderstood by many professionals as well. But what a lot of people probably don't realize is that a lot of gamers don't really understand it either. They understand their experience, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And I guess my aim is to try and bridge that gap. So I got a little presentation for you here. Let me just share that. Okay. So gaming in Australia. Now, I have to say that some of the stats I'm going to show you tonight are actually quite consistent with what I've seen in North America as well. So it's not just here. But some of these might surprise you. So 34 years old is the average age for gamers in this country. And the vast majority of gamers in this country are actually adults. Now, it's not just everybody playing Fortnite, by the way. These are all video games that across the spectrum. And 2/3 of the whole country plays as well. So that includes your grandma playing Candy Crush. And pretty much every home with kids has video games. So they're pervasive. And I think that parents are understanding this, especially during our pandemic. 45% of gamers are female, and the breakdown of the 2/3 of the country is about 90 minutes a day for males and 71 minutes for females. But in terms of, what we would consider a largely problematic age, if we're talking about the 15 to 24-year-old boys, it goes up to about 130 minutes. And it's the last time they did this survey, it was actually higher, which is confusing to me. But what's also significant about this group is that 12% of it is playing more than 4 hours a day, and these stats were done before the pandemic. And as you are probably well aware, our gaming time has gone up. And there's also something else that I always like to lead off with this, because there was a great study done by Dr. Andrew Shabilsky from Oxford, which basically said, that there is a value add to playing video games. If you go from no gaming to about an hour a day, there is a boost to your well-being. And then from my understanding of the study, between the first hour and then the second hour up to the third hour, it doesn't really get any better and it doesn't really get any worse, but then it kind of drops off a cliff after 3 hours. That's what they came up with in their study. And I find this consistent with the gamers that I work with and the families that I work with, because a lot of gamers, not all, are playing to perform. They're playing to compete, and you can't keep your top level of focus for hours and hours and hours on end. So at some point your focus is going to waver, and other things, as we'll talk a little bit about later, other things will sort of fall to the wayside. So why is it all so huge? What's all the fuss? Well, to do anything around that, I think I need to talk about motivation. So this is kind of why we do anything. This is a great theory that I engage with all the time. It's called self-determination theory. And if we understand that motivation is the energy for action, then we are motivated to feel competence in our lives. So we have a need to feel mastery. We want to see measurable progress. We like just to be good at stuff, right? And another need that we have, if you want to consider these things, think of them as 3 buckets that we try to fill, okay? And we're always trying to fill these buckets. Whether or not we are is another question. And so the second bucket then would be autonomy. And autonomy is really about self-direction. It's about, that agency, that freedom that we want over our choices. And if we think about, our teenagers out there, this is the age where they're fighting for that autonomy. They're fighting for that independence. They want to be able to do what they want to do. And, this is probably where the source of all this teenage friction with parents outside of gaming, kind of comes from. And then the third bucket that we try to fulfill is relatedness, which is basically social connection. But I like to focus on the idea that it's a sense of belonging and being part of something bigger than you, being part of a community. And there's certainly a gaming community out there. So I guess the important thing to understand here is that video games do a fantastic job of addressing every category, and the accessibility of video games and the fact that they're designed directly, really easy to hit those categories, but not fill the cups, not on their own. And so, that makes us think about the difference between the pleasure and the desire that we get from, dopamine-rich activities, things that make us feel that pleasure and reward, but also that desire for more of it, versus feeling fulfilled and topped up, those types of experiences that you might be able to relate to. Like, I give an example often of, if you're at a cafe with a friend that you haven't seen in a long time, you're catching up over coffee after 6 months. When you walk out the door and go your opposite directions, you don't turn around and immediately call back to them and say, hey, that was awesome, let's go back inside. But if you're playing Fortnite, it's hard to decide when to stop playing, so there's a big difference. And the other thing that's important to understand is that gamers are going to gravitate to the games that serve their unsatisfied needs the most. So I like to come at it from understanding, where the deficit is, and then understanding the games that they're playing and the purpose of those games. So the value proposition is the anticipation of needs satisfaction or needs fulfillment. Something else I think motivates us is chasing flow states. Now, I don't think that video games can provide the same level of flow state that someone who's surfing a wave can feel. Like, that is next level kind of stuff. But it's certainly close enough to the flow states and being in the zone that traditional sports can provide us. And I've experienced it on both levels, at a high level of sport and a high level of gaming, that, it can be very, very similar, just without the heart rate being raised as much. And so the thing is that there are certain genres out there that really feed to this. And so a lot of kids are playing competitive multiplayer games, as you may be aware of. And then there's also those linear games. I don't know if you've heard of Beat Saber, for example, but there's music going on and you have to like do things in rhythm and in timing. And that can sort of create that rhythm and play and sometimes result in a flow state once you've had lots of practice. But the other type of motivation that I find is the most troublesome is the fact that one of our other motivators is to seek this relief from psychological discomfort, from physical discomfort. Just we want to, it's the painkillers out there. And so video games can seem like a painkiller if they're doing it as a coping mechanism, okay? If they're playing video games to hide from something that's really tough in real life, as Dr. Carr-Gregg talked about before, if someone is hiding from an actual anxiety disorder in game, it's a great distraction. And there's all sorts of other ways where you feel like you're meeting your needs. And that's great for short periods of time. But if you are escaping and video games have their, their mechanics, depending on what kind of games, you could be vulnerable to creating a problem there. So not all games are created equal, though. I'm just going to show you a little continuum here that I like to put out. So if you want to say that on one end of the continuum, we've got games that are engaging, and in the other end, we've got games that are compulsive, all right? You may not know all these titles here, but I'll try and lay it out for you. I would say that a traditional sport is on the far end of the continuum for engagement. In terms of meeting your psychological needs of competence, autonomy, and relatedness, sports, especially team sports, are great at doing this. Games like Minecraft, popular across all ages, really, not just young ones, are very much based around creativity, and that kind of meets autonomy needs quite well because you have that self-direction. Esports titles might have some elements of compulsion in them, but really they're almost mimicking sports. Fortnite and other battle royale games, they're competitive, there's a lot of skill, there's a lot of engagement involved, but there's also mechanics that we don't have time to go into tonight, but there's also mechanics involved that can keep you feeling conditioned to repeat your actions quite often. There's another one here that I'd say Fortnite has that built into the game, whereas NBA is a sports game, and it's a great sports game with all these other things on the side that they're compulsive sort of mechanics. Okay, they're similar to, I think if I remember correctly, there's actually a spinning wheel, almost like what you would find at a casino to try and get a prize, for example. So there's some relationships to gambling sometimes. Destiny is a kind of game where one of your outcomes, one of your goals is to beat bosses, let's say, and then get random things out of it. And so, there's a variable reward mechanic that keeps us guessing. We love that mystery. We love that uncertainty, extends the novelty of the experience that you're having. And then I would say that games like Candy Crush or any freemium mobile game that makes, Candy Crush has on many occasions made over $2.2 million a day. And it's a free game. So how does that happen? It's not a very good game either if you want to compare it to some of the games we find on that end. So there are some, and then a Poke Machine will be right on the end of that continuum. So yeah, the engagement side of the continuum is about fulfilling your needs as best you can in game, or at least trying to. And then the compulsion side are very much that conditioning, those conditioning mechanics that you'll see that make you repeat tasks. And the thing is, even if your needs aren't being met, or even if you're not fully enjoying it, it kind of feels like a job sometimes. It kind of feels like you want to keep going. Okay, so just a little idea of what I see, and this is what maybe a lot of parents might have seen before or during or after COVID. We'll see the same thing, I think. I call it redlining. And it's kind of the snowball effect of playing too much. So if you want to use my little analogy here of a car and your RPMs, if you rev them too high, you might blow the engine. And in this case, RPMs are for rewards per minute. And you get them, and that's great from playing exciting video games. But if you overplay, it's like redlining your RPMs. You're stressing your engine. And one of the things, there's lots of terms for this, but you can basically get dopamine exhaustion. So your ability to soak up the reward and pleasure and feedback that you want to get from those games, it diminishes over time. You adapt. So you don't want to overplay because you're actually shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak, because you're ruining the experience for yourself. That's one of the things I like to teach the gamers and the families that I work with. And the frustration that we see, which a lot of people, the frustration that we see, that it comes from feeling incompetent in the game. It's from trying to fulfill one of those core needs we discussed, and expecting to, but not being able to. And if you play too much, you might not be able to concentrate enough, and then you won't be able to hit those nates. And then that frustration is what leads to aggression, way more so than any, I guess, opinions I would say in my experience about the violent content creating aggression. Frustration definitely creates aggression. So video games can definitely lead to that. But so can sports. You know, Serena Williams yelling at a ref and people smashing rackets. It happens as well for the same reasons. And then, of course, if you're redlining too much, there's definitely a risk of disengaging when we're fooled into thinking that games can fulfill our needs as well as real life, and that's just not true. So how long should we be playing? Look, it's, you know, it kind of similar to the concept of, you know, it's age doesn't define maturity. In this case, it's not about the time that you spend playing, it's about the motivation. So understanding the motivation is the first point. I still think that just to not make it a habit, just don't play every day. And that's not as easy to do. Like, there's a lot of education that comes into play to try and convince a gamer why they don't want to play every day, and to support the family and helping that happen. But my experience has been that I like to try and, on average, if a gamer maxes out at 3-hour sessions, then they're educated to know that, you know, past 2.5 hours, and this is for teenagers, by the way, you know, you're probably not going to be able to feel fulfilled if you keep going. It's going to get worse. You're going to want to keep playing, and you're not going to be able to get what you want. So this is what we talk about when we say playing beyond the benefits, right? And also taking a few days off during that week will really help the prevention of that dopamine exhaustion, so that you space it out a little bit. You make the experience more fun. And in some of the approaches that I've taken with competitive gamers, that some of them find that they compete better as well because they've got a clear head and they've learned more thoroughly, let's say. And of course, that these times that I'm giving here, that's definitely a pre-COVID sort of number, and we just adapt it on a case-by-case basis for families. But that's definitely sort of where I find the sweet spot is. So what can we do right now? Just to close it out for you guys. I'm going to give you 3 simple tips that you can do right now with your families. And the first one is get involved. Sit down with them, get coached. You don't have to like it. You might not, you probably won't like it. It doesn't matter. They will feel valued if you take interest in their passion, just like if you took interest in their art passion or their soccer or basketball passion. Again, you don't have to cheer for them when they're competing in games, but just be a teammate and not an opponent. And you'll find that the conversation changes drastically just from that first one. Support social gaming. If you can go out of your way, especially post-COVID, to have friends come over or to send your kid to another buddy's house to actually play shoulder to shoulder, sitting in the same room, which is more inconvenient, but way more worth it. The experience is the highest quality of gaming that I think you can have socially. And it is very much about socializing. It doesn't matter that they're looking at the screens, and it presents you with an opportunity to pivot to something else because they're actually there together. So go see a movie, go get some food, go to the park, play some ball. So support social gaming. Go out of your way to do it if you can, and you'll earn definite. I guess the credit system really should be that they're earning your brownie points from you, but it does work the other way too, I think. It's harder for them to disagree with you if you're supporting that, I think. And then another tool that you can use is just free on the website. You can go check out the gamers page. There's a quiz for gamers on that page, as well as a quiz for parents on the parents page. And there's a bunch of content there that I think is just good for everybody to know about gaming intelligently, so you can kind of get the most out of the experience without overplaying, and create space for everything else that you need to achieve and accomplish as you're developing into an adult, or even as an adult trying to stay developed as an adult. I don't know. And so I guess the last thing I would say is that the approach that I think works, and all the time that I've spent in the last 6 years working with families to do this, it's really about, you can't expect a teenager to self-regulate fine, especially younger kids. You can't expect them to do that just on their own, but teaching self-regulation with training wheels and supporting them with strategies, that is definitely achievable and has been, I guess, my bread and butter. So self-regulation with training wheels, guys, because the main point here is, if we don't teach them how to do that now, if they don't know how to pump the brakes for themselves, then it's when they become adults and move out on their own and they don't have those skills, that's when we see a lot of problematic gaming. So thanks very
Thanks,
much.
Andrew. That's fantastic. A really fascinating presentation. I was really taken by some of those statistics and just how widespread gaming is. But I particularly love how you've framed gaming as a real positive if it's done in the moderate amounts, and I think that moderation obviously is key, and looking at what some of those underlying motivations are. If someone's avoiding emotions by diving into gaming, what conversations can be had, or how can we support young people to find ways of exploring those feelings rather than burning them in games, but also recognising those benefits with socialisation and autonomy, competency, like you described as well, was great. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to our third and final speaker for this evening, Yasmin London. So Yasmin's the Executive Director of ySafe, Australia's largest online safety education organisation. Yasmin ignites social change through education and courageous conversations. Her mission is to equip people with the skills and knowledge to ensure technology enhances their modern-day lives rather than detract from it. Having previously spent 13 years in the New South Wales Police Force, Yasmin has truly been at the coalface when it comes to dealing with the real-life consequences of negative online behaviours experienced by young people, parents and advocates trying to navigate the complex digital terrain. So welcome, Yasmin. What can you tell us about online safety?
Thank you so much for having me, Mike, and it's been amazing listening to the speakers before me. Thank you so much, Andrew and Michael. Online safety, it's a really hot topic. I know that there'll be lots of questions around this after my presentation, but I guess it's a really integral area for parents to get at least a basic understanding around so that they can support their children. There are a lot of pitfalls, as we've heard, around what can actually happen online. But, one of the things that I'm really passionate about, I guess, is trying to equip children and parents with those positive skills, that knowledge, that correct information, so they can make good choices and have positive online experiences. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. I'll just share my screen really quickly so everybody can see it, and I'll get going. So as I mentioned, online safety is a really key component to the overall online wellbeing conversation. I think it's great to focus on, mental health. It's great to understand things like screen time, but there's a whole range of other issues that parents need to be aware of. They need to know how to manage to support their children. Now, according to the Office of the eSafety Commissioner, which is Australia's overarching government body, these are the top 8 key concerns or key areas that we really need to be aware of as parents. Now, you've probably seen a lot of these before. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail around cyberbullying and sexting and nudes. But I guess just looking at the last couple of months, going through COVID and our children having this increased screen time, there's been, a large increase in reports to the Office of the eSafety Commissioner around negative experiences. So when it came to things like pornography and sexual content, we saw in the media lots of kids, unfortunately in the beginning periods of COVID being Zoom bombed, with quite graphic pornography. And obviously subsequent, attempts to manage that weren't always effective. So we need to understand how to use technology in an effective way. Screen time, this is a no-brainer. We've all spent so much more time in front of screens these days. And as, the previous speakers mentioned, this has a real impact on our physical, our mental health. Now, when it comes to screen time, as Andrew mentioned earlier, up to an hour a day, in terms of a lot of the research out there, has been found to be beneficial. But what we want to be focusing on when it comes to screen time as parents is less about the hours, the finite time, and more about the actual activity that they're engaging in or the quality of screen time. So one thing I'll get you to think about is, say, for example, you've got a 10-year-old boy, and every single day after school that child goes on to a particular game that's really violent. He plays it alone and he spends half an hour a day. That's under a lot of recommendations. Many parents would, I guess, be patting themselves on the back thinking that, that's not a whole lot of screen time. But that can be quite damaging for a kid that's being, involved in some high level consumerism, violence, lots of inappropriate content for his age. So that wouldn't be a great quality choice in screen time. Now, if you were to compare that same child to a situation where he might sit down for an hour and a half a day, maybe even 2 hours a day, in front of a YouTube tutorial with his older brother, learning how to make a skateboard. That's a really great way of utilising screen time in a positive way, where they're using their critical thinking skills, they're learning a skill. So it's really important as parents that we don't, I guess, push ourselves into a corner around a finite amount of time, and that we focus more on the activity rather than, you know, the amount of time that we're there. Cyberbullying I'll go into in a little bit more detail, but certainly this is something that we saw really skyrocket through COVID. The Office of ySafe, which takes reports of cyberbullying, actually stated that they had a 360% rise in reports throughout the month of March to them. So certainly with increased isolation, we saw children with less supervision, sometimes using the online world to fix boredom, to, I guess, express themselves when they might have been in a state of anxiety. We saw a lot of insensitivity going on. So certainly cyberbullying is something that we saw increase too. The other thing that was very concerning was the increase in activity on the dark web and the migration of predators, some offline to the online world as a result of COVID. And I'll talk about some statistics in just a minute, but one of the things that we talk a lot about when we do education sessions with young people is that idea of unsafe strangers, and how important it is that we prevent children from engaging in conversation with people that they don't know. So certainly younger kids, there are 3 rules that we will always talk to try and get them to stop talking, or to prevent them from talking to someone that they shouldn't be in the first place. Now, the first rule is that they need to know that person's first and last name if they're going to engage with them. The second rule is that they need to know that person in real life. And the third rule is that you, as their parents or caregivers, also know that person and approve of them engaging with them in the online space. They need to be able to say yes to all of those 3 rules to engage with someone. Now, there's a lot of pushback from kids with those rules, I'm not going to lie, particularly for kids that love gaming, where they will, often jump onto platforms like Fortnite or Minecraft that are multiplayer games, and that can be really difficult. But we need to start that conversation early about unsafe strangers, and as kids grow older, really get them to think critically about why someone might be contacting them, what their motive might be behind that, rather than just opening the door and letting them speak to whoever they like. Digital footprints are a really big issue. I won't go into that in too much detail tonight. Privacy and settings, certainly, when we sign up to social media platforms and games, we sign off those T's and C's, we enter in information that they can monetize. And we're seeing a lot of, I guess, the after effects of that, and the realization of what that actually means coming out in movies like The Social Dilemma, and conversations around technology platforms and what they're doing with our data. Games and gaming behaviours, I'll leave to the experts there. And then sexting and news, I thought we may as well get on with the information around that one. Before I do though, I wanted to show you a couple of statistics around what happened with COVID. So we obviously saw 1.5 billion children disengaged from safe school environments. And one of the big issues that we saw is that parents were under the assumption that the devices that came home from school were protected by the school network, when they often weren't. And so subsequently we had a whole range of kids that had unsecured devices at home. And so I guess I raise this to make sure that you know that as parents, there's a real role for you to play in terms of finding an effective parental control tool to help you manage your child's time online. So there's a range of suggestions I can make to you later on in the session, but certainly do yourself a favour, particularly if you have younger kids, and get a software that is going to help prevent pop-ups, prevent accessing inappropriate information for kids of certain ages. For you as parents to be able to block them from accessing social media platforms that you don't want them to be on. Nothing is perfect. Sometimes kids find ways around parental controls, but it's certainly better than nothing. So that's one tip that I can certainly give you, and something that really was emphasised over the last couple of months. We also saw, when it came to the increase in predators online, as I mentioned, a report that came out from an organisation called the We Protect Global Alliance was brought out in, I think it was March or April this year, had some pretty alarming statistics in it. And one of them was that they had seen a 106% increase in reports of child exploitation material to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. So just to give you an idea of the numbers, they in 2019 had around 983,000 reports reported to them in the month of March. In 2020, in the same month, those reports went to over 2 million reports of child exploitation. So there are people out there, unfortunately, that do want to do the wrong thing by our children. It is a very real problem, and is something that we need to have open and honest discussions with our kids about. Obviously, you know, appropriate in terms of their age, but we need to be brave about addressing those issues. We also saw a rise in image-based abuse. So sometimes, you know, throughout that isolation period, we saw kids sharing nude images of each other. And the motivation behind that was to try and establish trust, to try and maintain that strength in the relationship by sharing that and creating that intimacy. Now, when it comes to sexting material, it is still technically an offence in Australia. It's an offence against federal legislation and state law. There are some exemptions for older kids, which mean that they won't be charged, which is a really, really great thing. But we do need to make sure that kids understand that it is against the law to share images like this. And, you know, even as an ex-police officer, I care about the law, but I care much more about a child who shares an image, you know, under an agreement to a partner, and having that image shared, you know, spread far and wide. One of the first instances I ever dealt with in the cyber world was a Year 7 girl who shared an image with her boyfriend, and in close to 24 hours that image had been shared to around 300 people in her school. So, you know, the social and the emotional impact on a young person, if something like that happens, is significant. There was also a 200% increase in posts in 9 known child sex abuse forums. So again, to drive that message home, it is really important that we understand and we involve ourselves in our children's online lives, particularly when it comes to who they're talking to. Now, interestingly, when it comes to teens and nudes, we know that 52% of sexting requests actually come from people that they don't know. So, you know, I think kids will be pretty honest in saying that most of the time, most of them will have spoken to someone that they would consider a stranger, that they wouldn't be able to say yes to those 3 questions to. So we know that this is happening. And interestingly, when it comes to our girls, 1/3 of them have actually reported feeling sexually harassed online. So what this tells us is that when they're speaking to people, if they are speaking to, you know, people that they know or strangers, that they're not actually taking no for an answer the first time. So that can be quite stressful. And, you know, after a little while, you know, kids can unfortunately just give in. And that's a really, really sad situation for them to be in. We also know that 12% of teens have reported sending nude pictures on without consent. Now, the important thing to understand around that issue of consent is, as I mentioned before, there are certain situations where discretion can be utilised by police or law enforcement, and usually that will concern consent. That image sharing between 2 young people of a similar age has to be consensual. The minute that somebody shares that image outside of that agreement, that then becomes the distribution of child pornography material for which they can be charged. And those are really significant charges. You know, no child's ever going to be charged without it going to the Director of Public Prosecutions in New South Wales. And there are certain levels that the police have to go through, but certainly it becomes much more serious if that image is shared on without consent. Now, when it comes to cyberbullying, I always like to set the record straight a little bit around this, because when I speak to parents and when I speak to kids and I ask them, what is cyberbullying? What does it mean to you? They almost always say mean and nasty words, you know, saying something nasty against someone in the online world. And that is just such a small part of what cyberbullying is. I want you to start thinking about cyberbullying as behaviours rather than just words, because these are the things that we are seeing happening more and more when we deal with kids in the online world. So cyberbullying relating to exclusion or inclusion. So this relates to mean and nasty words, but it might be that kids are, chatting on a private group and one child is excluded from that group. Or that inclusion style bullying is a situation where a child is excluded, the group talks about them in a negative way, and then they are then included into that conversation so they can see what people are saying about them. Roasting, polling is something that we see happen quite a lot where, on a certain social media platform, for example, 2 pictures are posted. The question in the poll is who's the ugliest person out of these 2 pictures. The group or, the year group, sometimes the whole school will vote, and those results are released out to the public. So that's really, really distressing for young people. When it comes to games in particular, we have to have conversations with our kids around the idea of banter. Where is the line between banter and bullying? Bullying is repeated and often direct, but, it sometimes can be really, really hard to discern what is banter and what is bullying. So as parents, we need to have that conversation. Hacking, impersonation often happens simply by sharing passwords. So, kids really need to form good digital habits, particularly when it comes to their privacy and security. When I go into schools, they love to talk about hacking, and they've watched a lot of movies, and they often visualize, that creepy guy with a black hoodie over his head, when the simplest way to get hacked is by, sharing your personal details. And this happens so often with kids when they share passwords. Lastly, there as well is screenshotting. There is no such thing as privacy on the internet or on devices, because everything that you post, everything that you share, everything that you write is simply just a screenshot away. Kids do have this out of sight, out of mind mentality sometimes, but we really do need to remind them that, the capability of every phone pretty much being able to take a screenshot or a laptop means that what we do online can be broadcast to many, many people. Quickly, some strategies that I guess can help you as parents manage cyberbullying. I mentioned screenshots. This is where you can actually use it to help you. So we like evidence. If there is things that are happening where you need to report negative incidents, it helps to take those screenshots. Please report it by using the family help centres on social media platforms or games. Remember to report it to the platform. Give them the opportunity to remove that content or intervene. Often you might not get a response. If we look at platforms like Instagram, for example, they now have over 1 billion monthly active users. So there's a lot of content to moderate. And if something goes wrong, the onus is on us to let them know. The other great thing about that is that if you don't get a response, you can then go to the Office of the eSafety Commissioner, and they can act on your behalf in terms of having that content taken down. Now, it does need to meet a certain threshold. It can't just be, a little argument between kids. It has to be, quite high level, but certainly they can get involved. They have a memorandum of understanding with every social media platform out there that says that they can force them to take it down. And that's something that's really important to kids, is seeing that content removed so that the damage to the victim isn't continued, but also to the bystanders that are there as well. They're all watching to see what we do, to see how we can advocate on their behalf. So we want to make sure that we're removing any kind of visual material that's distressing them. Really importantly here, ask your child how they would like you to get involved. So often when I was a police officer, I would deal with parents that would come to me and, they'd want a child arrested for what they said to their child, and there was a big argument that had gone on. And, after a day or two, the kids involved had actually sorted it out, but it was the parents that couldn't let it go. And so we really need to be cognizant and ask that question when we speak to our kids: what do you want me to do to help you? Because often they might just want to talk about the situation. They might want some really simple steps to help them manage, that incident spilling out into the school yard. example. So don't forget to ask that question. Remember to teach your child as well how to deal with conflict. You know, in many ways, we are raising, you know, the least resilient generation of all time. So where we can, it's really important that we teach them that conflict is a part of life and that we need to deal with it in, you know, an effective way. So I find role playing with kids is actually really effective. Helping them rehearse what to say, even those really, really simple things can give them the confidence to manage those incidents in real life. So try your best to make sure that they do learn how to do that. And then, of course, if they are having issues, particularly with someone at school, engage the school, work with the school. They are there to help you. They have a duty of care to act, to manage the situation once they're aware of it. So it's really important to work as a team where you can.
Thanks, Yasmin. We're almost out of time there. Is there anything you want to say just to wrap that?
No, this was my last slide, the 3 simple steps. So I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yasmin. That was wonderful. Really, you know, important conversations to have. Quite scary statistics, obviously, and something to be really aware of, that this is not a neutral world, the online one, that there are people behind it whose intentions aren't always good for us and certainly for our children. But being able to collaborate with your children, have conversations with them, and be open about what some of those risks are, I think is a really important thing. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm realising we're coming close to the end of our time, so I've got permission from our producers to go a little bit longer tonight with some of the questions, if you're able to hang around. We've had a bunch of questions pour in, so we want to get to some of these questions before we close. So feel free to keep submitting them. We will certainly try to cover any of those questions that we don't get to tonight in the material that is sent out post-webinar. So our first question, we have a question for both Michael and Yasmin. Michael, you wrote a review about technology use in school. Can you tell us briefly more about your review? And is it mandatory for New South Wales schools to implement the recommendations, or were they just suggestions? I just need to unmute there, Michael.
Thanks very much. Look, yeah, I was asked by the Minister of Education in New South Wales to review the use of mobile phones in secondary schools and in primary schools. And the recommendations were really, ironically, implemented holus bolus in Victoria, in Tasmania and in WA, but not in New South Wales. So my recommendation was that there'd be a ban on mobile phone use from first bell to last, and that technology wasn't to be used at lunchtime or at recess. The reason for that is that the lived experience of schools who had done that was, first of all, a reduction in distraction, an increase in socialization, and a decrease in bullying and harassment. So for me, it was a no-brainer. Politically, you have to actually be a bit courageous to do that. And I'm afraid the New South Wales Minister of Education wasn't and didn't. And I think that's most regretful. But it was a report with recommendations. It couldn't do anything else. Happy to say 3 states in Australia took them up. New South Wales didn't.
It goes to show how important it is to set boundaries, doesn't it, you know, with children, and it sounds like a really clear, practical way of setting some of those boundaries with technology. Thanks, Michael. Yasmin, I'm curious, somebody's asked about the home network and students being online at home not being protected by the school filter network. Can you tell us a bit more about that? This particular person thought that they were protected if they were using a school laptop at home.
Yeah, look, it depends on the software that the school is using, but a lot of the time it is based on the location of that device. So that will be filtered on school grounds. Often schools will create partnerships with software providers that will then offer, you know, a mobile device solution to parents in terms of using that in the home to keep that device protected. But often, unfortunately, there's not a really big uptake on behalf of parents, often because, you know, it can sometimes seem quite overwhelming. It can be quite complicated to implement depending on the software that you're using. But for a lot of schools, not all, but a lot of schools and their devices, they were effective on school grounds only. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Yasmin, for clarifying that. Andrew, a question for you. There are so many videos on YouTube aimed at young people watching other people gaming, such as Minecraft. Are there any risks here?
Great question. So the streamer phenomenon is definitely very widespread, and if those of you who don't know, it's like we said in the question there. It's people who are playing games for other people, and they're talking and they're entertaining and everything like that. Is there a risk there? Well, it kind of depends. I mean, it comes down to the content again. Some streamers are, you know, their content is a little more edgy, and then other streamers are a little more wholesome. One of the major platforms, Twitch, has gone on a recent banning spree on people who are inappropriate and like completely revoking their accounts. So there's some level of authority that's taking some action there. But I guess the side that I always take is, you know, I want to see the motivation there. And I think that a lot of people will watch a streamer to learn, to be entertained, get a little bit of vicarious reward from watching them do something that they see the exact same view when they play. So, and the other thing is to be like, each channel sort of has a sense of community, if that makes sense. So they're meeting those same needs as well. But of course, there's no stopping cues. So there's nothing at all that's going to help you realize it's time to stop. So it requires a bit more self-regulation as well. So I'd say sit down and have a look at the actual, like, let them teach you, let them show you the streams they're watching, so you have a sense of what they're watching.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. Being informed, being collaborative, getting a sense of what it actually is that the child's watching. That's great. Thank you. Yasmin, you spoke, and Michael also mentioned the recent Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, and when they talk about the idea that corporations are extracting our attention for profit, is educating children that they may become a commodity when they're using social media an important thing to do?
Absolutely. I think, you know, those conversations need to happen early and often at the right developmental level for that child. I think speaking at schools quite a lot, they're aware of, I guess, the fundamental or simple ways that they are being productized. But it's a conversation that's ongoing. You know, there's always new ways that they will utilize data to create profit. I think, you know, movies like the Social Dilemma are really great because they elicit conversation. You know, I watched that. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was a little bit fear-mongery, if I'm completely honest. I don't think they showed a completely balanced perspective. I think in my experience, having worked, you know, with some of these companies trying to create safety by design platforms, you know, iterations of what they're doing. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but I've seen them legitimately try to start creating safer environments for their people. So, you know, while I agree with the majority of what was actually on that platform, on that documentary, I think we just need to have a balanced perspective about it. And I think we can't come into this conversation with young people talking about how terrible technology is all the time, because that will drive a wedge between us and them. And the most important thing that we need to do is have that open conversation with them about the benefits of technology so that we can explain the risks to them and have them hear us. You know, we need to show that we're on their team, and that while we might not know everything and that the technology world will evolve, that we stand beside them and that we're there to teach them how to cope with it and how to be resilient and how to have positive experiences. That way we have that two-way communication, and I guess that's the best chance for them to have a good experience as well.
Yeah, beautifully said. Certainly nothing's all good or all bad, and technology is a great case in point. And I like your idea that we don't approach it with fear, but we approach it with appropriate levels of concern and interest to try to navigate a conversation about it. Thanks, Yasmin. So one for you, Michael. We've got a question about parents posting photos and inadvertently information about their children on their public social media, business sites, etc., which are often tied to paid advertising. So what advice would you offer to parents before the child has the emotional literacy and fundamental tools to cope with such exposure? You're just on mute there, Michael.
Yeah, I think parents should avoid sharenting, as I think it's referred to. Look, to me, it's about educating yourselves as a parent. This particular book, Sex, Texts and Selfies by Susan McLean, is one that I recommend to all parents in order for them to get an understanding of a world which, quite frankly, they didn't grow up in. Many of them actually grew up in a world where there weren't any computers at all. So it's not about bagging them. It's about making sure that they are informed. And Yasmin's talked about the Office of eSafety website. I think that's absolutely fantastic. It keeps up to date and it provides parents with all the information that they should know. My view is I'm very protective of young people. I don't think we should be sharing pictures of them outside of the family, because I think it gives pedophiles a really good idea sometimes of who the kid is, where they are, what school they go to, and you're just asking for trouble. I'm no law enforcement expert, but to me, it's from the University of the Bleeding obvious that you don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, an important university. It would be nice to have more people attend sometimes. Thanks, Michael. So, Andrew, a couple of questions for you. We've got one about any tips to get kids off their games and out with their friends or do their homework. I'm sure that's a common one from parents. And also, what might be some safe online video games that primary age children could play?
Okay, I'll start with the online games one, because the other one's that's a long answer. So I was thinking about that. I saw that question before. Look, the games themselves, you're going to have a look at what they want to play and understand them, like I said before. But a couple of games that I think are great for younger kids are, one's called Rocket League. Rocket League is essentially cars playing soccer with all sorts of rockety flying abilities and stuff. It's a very competitive esport, and it's also something that's easy to get into with your friends, and you can play with people on your level, and I just think it's got a good community. Minecraft is an obvious one that typically when you can play it in different ways, but it's very much about creativity and ownership and autonomy. Any kind of rhythm and dancing, like sort of pattern recognition type of game with timing and stuff, like we mentioned before. So, for example, there are VR headsets that are coming out now that are quite inexpensive, and there's a very, very, very popular game called Beat Saber, where you've got lightsabers and you have to chop blocks in timing with the music and stuff. And those games are great, and they're also a form of exercise. And you can do that sort of on a computer as well. And so the only thing I'd say that a sports game like soccer or basketball are great, but as I mentioned before, it's the sort of the side game within the sports game that can be problematic, at least in the most popular titles. There are lots of other titles that might be worth it as well. So, do your homework, investigate, and see what kind of, is this compulsive stuff or is this engaging stuff?
So that's the easy one. Now about the hard one.
Can you repeat it one more time just to be 100%
so any tips
sure?
to get kids off their games and out with their friends or doing homework?
I mean, this is why, like, we do what we do. It takes a lot of education to the whole family to convince a gamer that they don't want to be on there all the time. But I'd say the main thing that we try to do is get them to see, if I'm playing these games, this specific game and this specific person, you match it all up for, let's say, I'm primarily driven by competence. I want to be good at that game. Well, you need to look for real life opportunities that help provide competence, right? Or if they're only playing because they play with their friends, and if their friends weren't on, they wouldn't play, then it's a social activity that you're trying to push into their lives, if you know what I mean. And that's easier to do once the long conversations have come into play, but that's essentially what needs to happen. It needs fulfillment, but not in game, because games will never do it on their own. They're just a value add. It's the icing on the cake, not the cake.
Yeah, great. And it's really important, as you've emphasised tonight, that have those conversations, find out what is the motivation, what are they getting from it, and really be able to open that up with the child to be informed about what it means for them.
And interestingly, if you sit down and you play a game and you get coached and you discuss and find out what they get out of it, you might get something else. It might not be the same thing. Even though a game might cater to a certain need, doesn't mean that that's what your prime reason for playing it would be.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. So our final question for tonight is for you, Michael. So what is the most important question, or important message, I should say, a parent can send a young person in 2020?
Wow. Well, I think there are probably three. One is, if in life you can't change something, you can always change the way you think about it. Second, see life as it is, but for goodness sake, focus on the good bits because there are plenty to see. And thirdly, the single most important predictor of well-being in anyone's life is not being good looking. It's not having lots of money. It's not having more good things happen to you than bad. It's having a rich repertoire of friends, on or offline.
The real healthy connection, that's what we want, the person-to-person connection, and certainly we can all do with more of that. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate you sharing your wisdom. So we've come to an end of our webinar tonight. It's been a very engaging webinar for me, and I hope it has been for you as well. And we hope it's provided you with a greater understanding of some of the key stresses and issues affecting young people's increased use of technology, and as well as giving you some tips to support them as well. So to Michael, Andrew and Yasmin, we're extremely grateful for your time and insights. Thank you so much. Thank you also to the staff from Northern Beaches Council for holding this event, and Glen Street Theatre, who provided us with a venue and their technical expertise. To all of you logged on to join us this evening, thank you for your interest and questions. We hope you have a lovely evening. Good night.